Reclaiming and Documenting a Culture of Elder Women with Anne Marie Vivienne. Today, we aim to reconnect with the human experience with Wisdom Anthologies' own Anne Marie Vivienne. Anne Marie is a writer, a naturalist, a poet, a philosopher, and a documentarian. She's a devotee of a life of the ecology of beauty. Her writing and photography reflect her deep passion for nature, myth, archetypes, and the narratives that weave together a collective psyche and illuminate exterior and inner landscapes. Anne Marie listens to the soundscapes and the rhythms of people's narratives, cultures, and histories. She states, and I quote, "As we face an era of ageism and a loneliness epidemic, we turn to listening to the matriarchs who have raised families, nurtured careers, and built communities. Their wisdom of human connection and human experience has a real power to heal generations, facing the health, social, and economic risks of social isolation. We reclaim a culture of elderhood as we help families and communities reintegrate elder women and their stories into their own narratives." And I end quote. So Anne Marie is currently building a nonprofit movement around Wisdom Anthologies. She's also co-host of the podcast Iona with Ali Kessler and writes on their blog as well. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Anne Marie Vivienne.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited.
Such a pleasure to have you. And also to really kick off a very unique webinar today, where we're not going to be only exploring photography, but also your writing, your poetry, and going a little bit deeper into the concept. And I know we're going to hear some words from you before we get deep into the Wisdom Anthologies. I have to say it was such a pleasure to kind of curate these images and go through them and try to see underlying stories. So thank you for the privilege.
Oh, thank you. So this is one of my poems that's relevant to the theme we will be talking about, and it's called What the Women Are. Recognize the hum that created the earth, the lulling, haunting, wise song that is birthing an entire planet. The congregating clouds that move forcefully to clear out the old and bring in the new birth again, again. Recognize the curves like the mountains, like the tides, like the roots that maintain a forest of a living ecology. What the women are is in everything you eat, you breathe, you grow, you build, you love.
Such beautiful words. And you know, when I was going through all the poems, this really spoke to me and even though it's not part of this, it's a thread throughout all of your work. And I'll just read a little bit about Wisdom Anthologies, and then I just want to hear, you know, what your journey has been about. And also we're going to meet some of the beautiful, amazing people that you encountered. So we'll be meeting 5 characters throughout this presentation. And, you know, I do want to encourage folks to kind of be meditative as we get to them, because we will see a combination of landscapes, still lives, but about Wisdom Anthologies, you know, the main mission is to document these elder women who live ordinary lives in extraordinary ways. And this is, right, the 2-year mark of your research, Anne Marie, which you described as a gestation period. And within these 2 years, Anne Marie was able to interview 15 women in various locations, including Guatemala, England, Vermont, and Salt Lake City. Only half of them were willing to go on record, yet they all wanted to hear each other and simultaneously were hesitant to tell their own story. So without further ado, thank you. And Anne Marie, take it away.
Yeah. So thank you, Annabelle. Yeah, so it's been a couple years since this, you know, I've always been drawn to elder women, and I thought, why not make it a more serious focused project? And one of the reasons I'm very drawn to these women is I'm fascinated that they've gone through so many different phases in life, and they've learned how to cross into each new phase. You know, they didn't always know how to do that going into it, but they've done it. And I think as we all come to these thresholds within our lives, having the elder women around to tell their stories, not as these kind of step-by-step how-tos, but as an archetype, as a reminder that we too can cross these thresholds that sometimes seem so overwhelming as our lives shift and change. And I think right now we're all kind of in a threshold moment. And so I feel like their stories are even more relevant now. And so I just wanted to start by elaborating on this idea of thresholds and why I'm so drawn to it. And I'm actually going to read John O'Donoghue. He is an Irish philosopher poet, and I'm going to read his definition of a threshold. It's the one that draws me in the most right now. So this is what he says. At any time you can ask yourself, at which threshold am I now standing? At this time in my life, what am I leaving? Where am I about to enter? What is preventing me from crossing my next threshold? What gift would enable me to do this? A threshold is not a simple boundary. It is a frontier that divides two different territories, rhythms, and atmospheres. Indeed, it is a lovely testimony to the fullness and integrity of an experience or a stage of life that it intensifies towards the end into a real frontier that cannot be crossed without the heart being passionately engaged and woken up. At this threshold, a great complexity of emotion comes alive. Confusion, fear, excitement, sadness, hope. This is one of the reasons such vital crossings were always clothed in ritual. It is wise in your life to be able to recognize and acknowledge the key thresholds, to take your time, to feel all the varieties of presence that accrue there, to listen inward with complete attention until you hear the inner voice calling you forward. The time has come to cross. So that's John O'Donoghue and his take on thresholds. And with these women, now more than ever, like I was saying, you know, we are in a threshold moment, and we can turn around, we can, you know, go back down that road we came up, or we can decide to cross. And I think we're all looking at our lives, and we're all looking at, you know, the systems and the culture that we're in. And I find that being reminded that people have gone through these big thresholds before and they found a way is really inspiring, so that we all just don't crumple down in fear and anxiety. You know, it's like you need those stories to remind you that we're resilient.
And I think it's so important to not only gather those in a way that it can be passed on, but also for our own healing, right? Which is something you are very specific about in terms of how these stories can heal.
Yeah, and just even, you know, it's funny, you know, sometimes I think we overlook how simple the healing can be. You know, there's definitely reasons for, you know, big interventions to heal something. But I think often in these times, the things that will heal us most are the most ordinary things. You know, it's waking up and making your bed. And, you know, I'm like, that's the number one thing my mother taught me, you know, and it's you continue these rituals and these coming together, and you use them as a way, as portals to the next step. And they're not that complicated, you know, or it's as simple as singing the songs you used to sing together, or making the meals and cooking. And so, yeah, I think what I'm drawn to with these women and the details of their lives, I think a lot of people would overlook and see them as boring and ordinary. And I think in our own lives, we don't showcase these ordinary pieces of our lives because we don't think they're exciting and special enough. So I really part of this is to embrace the ordinary rituals, and they are rituals, the waking up, the making the bed, the having a coffee, the meeting the friends, you know, which a lot of us still can't do, go out and meet friends, and just think about how precious that is to us now that we don't have it.
Oh, and I think the times now have definitely added that reflection, right, of recognizing those special moments that might seem ordinary or that are really important to kind of look back into, and also maybe we'll cherish them in a different way moving forward. And we start this journey visually in Guatemala, and then we're moving into England, which to me was such an amazing contrast, but also, you know, similar in that they both have such long histories of matriarchs as well. You know, when I think of pagan deities and all that.
Yes.
So tell us about that, you know, that journey into the two different spaces and also very different relationships.
Yeah, so I mean, you know what you're pointing to, I think ultimately is the both of these places I'm are places where I went because I was drawn to both the land and the women. And I think this returning to the earth, returning to the land, and returning to its cycles, which I think women, you know, we embody cycles. And the women have, in both places, in Guatemala and in England, and all of us have ancestors where I think we were just more in tune with the land and the seasons and how there is a time and a season for everything, right? And I think we, in modern times, because you can almost fake a season, right? And so we kind of force these seasons to happen, and we force these deadlines on us. And I think the women and their connection to landscape in both of these places was really, it's just something I'm naturally drawn to, because I know for me myself that part of learning how to go through life is becoming very familiar with the seasons and the land wherever you are, whether you're, you know, closer down to the equator, and that's going to be a different seasonal rhythm, or you go up further north and that's a totally different rhythm. And so I pay attention a lot to, I wanted to just, you know, these women are friends too. And so it's just, I wanted to, I don't know, I guess I'm just drawn to very contrasting and the more variety, the better. So anyway, yeah.
And now we're in this beautiful, beautiful landscape. Can you share some words with us?
Yeah, so this particular, so a lot of what I'm doing as well with this kind of connection to the land and the women, I'm very interested in biology and tree ecology and learning from it. And as living, breathing organisms ourselves, you know, what can we learn from the trees? And so I often, you know, bring the women and the trees together. And I just had a reading here for you about how these two things are connected. So the elder women have become radical. They have roots, a life of experiences weaving together humans, memories, innovations, rituals, medicines, stories, and communities. They acknowledge their essence, that it is evolving, breaking down, and expanding into the earth of their own origin. When you sit with the elder women, you listen deeply, because you will think you have a list of important questions until you understand that there must be silence as she searches for what she wants to share with you in that moment. Do not interrupt her. There will be laughter at how absurd life can be, and there will be piercing poetry. In this anxious, overwhelmed, overstimulated world, the elder women have a pace like torque that will move you slowly and with power. So these trees, the next slide is, I wanted to bring Roz into it. She's a dear friend, and her walking among the trees and spending time with her. You know, the more time you spend with these elder women, they give you their blessing. They see you, they hear you, they honor you, and they see what you're doing in life. And I think sometimes it's nice to just know that been seen as well. And they, just as you're willing to listen and hear and see them, they return that. So, yeah.
And this particular image, to me, just visually, right? I'm getting the sense they don't want to be on camera. And at the same time, I love the idea that you're following them. I love the idea that they're in a journey. Mm-hmm. So when photographing and thinking about your poetry and your writings, which are so inherently can't live without one another almost, what is that? What's your process in terms of connecting with them, but also thinking about the writing?
Yeah, so it is it's quite a journey from the creative side as well, but really illuminating. Yes, the women, they hesitate to be photographed, and so what I've learned to do is to find ways. You know, I say sometimes, you know, they're invisible, but really they're just camouflaged, and they like to kind of melt into their surroundings, whether it's, you know, these landscapes or even their family. They're much more willing to be photographed when their grandkids are around them, and it's a family portrait. You cannot separate these women from their environment, whether that's, you know, the landscape around them or their families. So the more you can bring in the family or the landscape, they want to be recorded with that. They want that. They don't want a solitary portrait with, like, you know, a nice backdrop and studio lighting. No way. Because to them, their life isn't about them. They're very aware of the ecology that they have created, and that they, you know, to separate it would just kill the whole thing. And so part of the creative process then is I do a lot of listening first before I even take out my camera or a pen or anything. I listen a lot, and I spend a lot of quiet time with them, and I get to know the landscape and just really try to absorb. And because to me, their lives are more than what they'll ever be able to articulate. And so, you know, as I listen, first I listen, that's my first and foremost. And I do that for a very long time. And then get familiar with the rhythms and the cadences. And then I would say the writing and the photography happen at once. You know, then things start to take form, and sometimes I need to see it before I can articulate it with word, and sometimes I need to articulate it before I can compose it within the photograph. So the photography and the writing, they kind of come hand in hand, and it's different senses, and they're just interplaying with each other.
I mean, yeah, no, I think it's amazing because the images do evoke poetry, and the poetry evokes visual, you know, imagery. So a little bit more about Ross, and I know you met them in Salt Lake. And
well, I actually met Roz in Mexico.
Oh, in Mexico, okay.
Roz is a world traveler and has many stories. So Roz grew up just outside of London. You know, she has this wonderful story that as a 10-year-old, she had dinner with Benjamin Britten, the composer, and had no idea who he was, just thought, what an interesting way to spell Britain, which is not the same as the country. Anyway, so she has this very kind of a little bit more refined upbringing, but then, you know, in her early 20s, she and her girlfriend decided they had had enough of their surroundings and wanted an adventure. So they took off and came west to the States, to Wyoming, and got hired on at a dude ranch to work with the horses, and had a very kind of Wild West experience. And she tells this lovely story about how, you know, the first time they were celebrating the 4th of July, and everyone was just dancing out in the middle of the street, drinking beer and dancing to Elvis Presley, which she's like, I never could have got away with that back home in England. And so, you know, she gets to go have these wild adventures, and she's never stopped having her wild adventures. And so, you know, a lot of times I feel like the women are telling us to slow down, and I listen, and more, you know, I always think I can go slower and remind myself slower still, slower still. in the sense of not worrying and not rushing through life, but to enjoy it and to take advantage of every opportunity, and to don't, you know, just not to sweat it because somehow like things just work out. The women know this. It's like they're finally giving in to the magic of it. But yeah, so that's Roz, and this is her home that she inherited from her family in the Lake District up north. Her mother died about 30 years ago, and she inherited this place where she grew up, spending a lot of time here in the summers. And she's continued to keep the garden that her mother. So in this sense, you know, I look at this picture and I see the flowers, and a lot of these rose bushes that are around here were her mother's. And so in a way, it's a portrait of her mother too. You know, like there's generations in this garden, and you can see how they've taken care of it and they've preserved it, and just how precious this place has been to them. And Roz gets to keep coming back and returning here. And I think she's, you know, she's got thoughts that this is where she's gonna finish out her life.
Yeah, you mentioned that she's also in Vermont half the time.
Yeah, so she lives in Vermont part-time. But yeah, so she gets to hop back and forth across the pond, and I think the hopping back and forth might be slowing down. So
no, but it's beautiful how we can also think about portraiture as the garden, as their homes, as their altars. Now we're in Salt Lake.
yes.
And can you introduce this beautiful woman?
Yes, this is Pilar Pobil. She is an artist here in Salt Lake City. She's from Mallorca, Spain, originally. And she, her home is her art. You go into the interiors and it's so colorful. She has painted every inch of her home. She has a mausoleum in her basement where she hopes to have her ashes kept. And she hosts, you know, these art in the garden cocktail parties. She loves to bring women together in the community, especially artist women, and she's a big advocate of women's rights and has a big loud voice. She is the one woman who is happy to get in front of the camera, happy to say anything. She realizes the importance of women's voices being heard, and she is just full of fire. And she isn't stopping anytime soon. And so she's just, you know, she's one that is a good template for what it looks like to follow your heart and your passion. She started painting when she was just a little girl, and her father was her biggest advocate. And when he died when she was 8 or 9 years old, her mother tried to put a stop to her art because she didn't see it as appropriate. But Pilar went and got herself a job without her mother knowing so that she could get some money to pay for her art supplies, and painted in secret for years before she moved to Salt Lake City.
Amazing. And you see also just the history that they have been accumulating, but also the fact that you're documenting adds that layer of, I think, of being seen, you know, and being heard when it comes to folks that have been documenting in their own way, their own personal history. Really beautiful. I love this image. The detail of her hand over her art is just really gorgeous.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, you know, that that it's sometimes, you know, the women, they don't necessarily want to come out and start talking about themselves, but as soon as you start to point out either their art or the objects that they've collected, they want to tell you about those things. And it's a really good lens into their lives. You know, you walk into their living room and you can say, tell me about this lamp, you know, and they have a story about the lamp, and it will open up this whole world and this whole history. And so it's really that simple. I think sometimes we make it complicated and we want to dive in too deep too fast, which, you know, I don't think anyone really wants to be.
I mean, just this image of, you know, it's seeing their life, you know, in this altar almost has a feeling of an altar. Really,
Yeah, and it is.
So in Salt Lake City, they were not only communicating with you, but they were also sharing the art with you?
Pilar?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so yeah, this is all in Salt Lake City. So this is actually, she's a neighbor of mine. So her art is just within her house. And then, I mean, she's sold all art that's been, you know, it's all over the world now. But yeah, this is all with the art that she still has in her home. And yeah.
What is her art mostly about? I know you mentioned women, but are we the painting that we're seeing here? Is that one of her art pieces as well?
Yes, that is one of hers. So yeah, she all the art on the wall is hers.
Okay.
So yeah, so she does. She paints women and she paints historical stories, mythical stories. She makes up stories. She's very passionate about all of it. So yeah, she's a fan of this whole project and the one willing victim, I guess you might say.
And if you may please introduce this beautiful woman.
Yeah, so this is my mom, Diane. So I always have to bring in my mom, and because you know, I think I was always inspired by her relationship to her mother, and she's always talked about this connection to the matriarchs, and she's always talking about, you know, the line through the mothers, and I loved hearing stories about from my mom about my great grandmother who was a midwife during World War II, and hearing how the women really came together while the men were gone. And, you know, there was these really beautiful moments, but then also these really terrible moments, you know, when they come to the door and they told my great grandma that one of her sons had been killed. And just, you know, so there's all these stories that I loved, and even the heartache stories. And it just reminded me that there are strong women in my family, and my mom is one of those. And yeah, and she also has such a great sense of humor, and that's something I really wanted to capture. She hates being in front of the camera. I had to beg her, and I knew one way that to relax her was to get her to laugh. So I won't tell you what I was telling her in this moment to get her to laugh. It's probably not appropriate. She has a interesting sense of humor, and so I just knew I needed to get her to relax, and the quickest way to do that was to get her to laugh. And as her daughter, you know, I had a quick insight into what that would be to get her to laugh and to relax a little bit.
You captured such a beautiful moment. It really, you just see such joy and peacefulness. How do you see this evolving within your family, or you know, what has been their feedback in terms of you collecting stories?
They're all very supportive. They love it. And although, you know, my mom, she's one of those who she feels fiercely that this is an important project, but as soon as I say, well, that means that's you're part of this, then she gets a little shy. But she knows she loved the stories from her mother and grandmothers, and so they're all very supportive of it, and the telling of the stories, you know. And I've done the same thing with my own mom, and learned things that I had no idea, and learned things about her and her own heart that I didn't know before, that are really, I'm so glad I know now. You know, whether or not I end up writing about them is another thing, but I'm just so happy I know them.
No, because, you know, with these stories, we're going to get the joy, we're going to get the pain, right? We're going to go through all the motions of, you know, living a life. And now we are in this nice fire, and we're back in Guatemala.
Yeah, so I just finished up my second visit to Guatemala a few months ago, and so this is kind of back to that idea of just like the ordinary, right? And how I really do see the ordinary as sacred. And these cooking moments, over the fire. I think we forget sometimes how just what a miracle our having a meal is. And so to me, there's all these links with that fire and it being the hearth and the center of a home and a life. And these women have that fire within them. So it's continuous. Yes.
Yes, and now I would love to hear you introduce this gorgeous woman here.
Yeah, so I'm going to read this one.
Thank you.
So this is Benita. She is at a threshold. This is not her first threshold, but it was her last, at least as this woman in this life, and who she became over the past 100 years. I keep forgetting that I am alive. This was the first thing Benita said to us when we walked into her door. Benita was blind, and she lived with her younger sister, Manuela, who was deaf. They swung quietly in their hammocks in their small home at the top of a steep staircase that climbs from the town center in the Polo Chic Valley in the mountains of Guatemala. The fire on the floor is almost out. A thin smoke like incense wafts through the light, cracking through the stick walls. Benita tells us that life now feels like the dream. Her sense of reality shifts as she approaches the final threshold. It's been a while since anyone has sung to her. She missed singing, but she heard our voices. Manuela did not. So these two sisters, we first met Benita and Manuela 2 years ago. And Benita died just a few months before I got to return, so I didn't get to see Benita again. But Manuela is still living at the age of 95, and she's at a home with a family, and she feeds the turkeys every day, and that she's very adamant that she get her chores done. She interrupted our conversation at one point to make sure we had to go make sure the turkeys were fed. But it was such a surreal experience to sit with Benita and her talking about, I keep forgetting that I'm alive. And it just is that reminder of, how fragile life is, and, and questions about what is our reality. And this, she was crossing the threshold. She was kind of in this in-between place where, and this is Rosa, and the same thing with her, as they talk, you can sense that they're not totally here anymore. They're starting that transition. They're beginning to cross. And I think these moments are especially sacred moments. And, the thing that Benita wanted most was to hear singing. And, it's said that the last sense that we lose as we're dying is our hearing for most people. And so I just, we were able to sing for Benita, and I just think that was such a gift for us to sing to her in her own language, these songs that she hadn't heard for so long. The translator with me had, written out some songs for me so I could sing along. And it was, I think, how else do we have these moments to remind us of, how precious it all is? And so unless we take the time to sit and listen and sing, it's been such a gift.
And as you're here with them and you're listening and also the revisiting, I know you mentioned you observe and listen first before, the writing or the photography. How did, in this particular case, photographing felt in the space for you?
Sorry, can you ask that again? So how?
Okay, I'll rephrase it. What was your approach, and in the space, in this particular set of images, in approaching to photograph and document?
Yeah, so again, there was a long time of just listening. Didn't even bring out my camera for a very long time, for hours. And then as, it helps when I have someone else with me. So that's the benefit of having, needing a translator with the women in Guatemala, is I had someone else to kind of you know, keep the conversation going as I could kind of photograph around as we were ending. This is all towards the end of the conversation that I finally pull out a camera, and with their permission, and you know, they're all shy, but I think they also, it's fun because, you know, when a lot of people don't have cameras around, photographs become something special, and you remember that, oh yeah, this is not something invasive, but something special, and they know that. And so I think sometimes their hesitation isn't over, they don't want to be captured or have a portrait of them, but they realize that it's special, and maybe they aren't in their best dress, or they didn't, you know, get as washed up as they had hoped for this really special moment. So
Amazing. And I love this image. I love the idea of these generations together. Um, and I'm assuming when you go back each time, you'll be seeing these generations grow and change. On your second trip, just seeing, you know, all the family and Benita already having passed, I can't imagine the value of the image that you took of them. What was their reaction when you shared the photographs?
it was so fun. It's just pure joy. And you know, we brought a stack to a few people in the neighborhood as well who had connections to Benita, and they had buried her only, you know, a few months before. And so, you know, it was just, you know, and then the stories come rolling out. They see the pictures, and it's, you know, I love being able to do that for them, and just to see the joy on their faces. So.
I mean, that's the beauty and power of photography, or just the visual language, that it's universal. And you can, you know, say so much. And we're towards our end, and I'm really excited to start opening it up to questions. But really just beautiful and moving, and I think so important right now, Anne Marie, to be highlighting this when our elders around the world are even more vulnerable in these times. So thank you so much for, you know, sharing all of this with us today. So Antonio, are there any questions? We'd love to hear from our beautiful audience. What do we have?
Sure. So we've got some great questions, and some lovely comments, by the way, in the chat. I must add as well. People commenting on how, you know, they love the portrait of your mother. You know, the people you've photographed, how each image tells such a story, even with the person not in the photograph at times. So yeah, we've got some great questions, Anne Marie. How do you find these ladies? How do you come across them?
So it's really word of mouth. I tell people what I'm doing, and they say to me, you should know so-and-so. Or in the case of Roz, I knew Roz. She was a personal friend. But the others, it's just people hear what I'm doing, and they immediately can, you know, think of someone. Usually it's their grandmother, and then usually their grandmother hears what I'm doing, and they say, oh no. So I get lucky sometimes, and sometimes the women agree to let me come sit with them.
That's great. Now another question I really like. Do your photos drive your poetry, or does your poetry drive your photography?
Oof. I think the majority of the time it's my writing leads to the photography. And I think because I'm so musically driven beneath all of this, my writing has a musical cadence to it. And so that's how I feel first. And when I make a photograph, I want it to reflect a feeling. And so I need to feel through the words first, and then I can make a photograph, because I'll know what kind of feeling I want to capture.
Gotcha. And so kind of a follow-up to that, would you say, if you had to pick, which creative avenue you had to go down, right? Could you live without writing, or could you live without photography? Do they have, to be both?
I feel like this is the question of, like, would you rather be blind or deaf, you know? And I think I would pick writing in words, because I think that language is what creates a culture, and it's the music. And I think for me, yeah, if I had to give one up, I might have to let the photography go.
It's okay. I think everyone would forgive you, because you've got great writing talent as well. but it's your combination that makes your
yeah, they really
special.
Yeah, and I think I always say I'm a in that sense, I'm a sensual person. I love all my senses and using all of them. I want to hear, I want to see, I want to speak. I want a whole kind of full experience. So
Awesome. And another thought that I had is, we all have elders in our lives. I hope everyone has some elders in their lives that are at least with you for part of your life. And it's so often for many of us to take them for granted. And as photographers, there can be that element of like, in the back of your head, maybe you don't want to admit it, you don't want to think about it, you don't want to dwell on it, but there's a time limit for how long you have until you can take pictures even remotely like the kinds of pictures that you make, but something that reflects on the lives of the elders in your family. What do you say to, because when you have that inertia, that tricky part to get started on a project like this, even just for your own personal, take a portrait of your mom, or someone else in your family. Do you have a tip for people that want to do this kind of thing? Document their elders in their golden years, but it's tough to get started on it.
yeah, I know it's that kind of facing reality that's first hard. It's facing the reality that they are going to be gone. And I think that brings up a lot of emotion, and we'd rather keep it just kind of under the rug or in the closet. Not only are we sad that we'll be losing them, but it means a lot for ourselves that it's a reminder that we're not going to be here forever either. And so, it starts for me in a simple personal practice. I have a meditation every night where I practice loss. What have I lost today? This day is gone. And I see that as something beautiful in a way. So it's almost like you have to start practicing, that grief is real, that loss is real. And then even once you do decide that this is something you want to do and you want to sit with the elders in your own life, honesty always is the best. And I think being direct, and I think I found that the elders, the more honest you are about where they're at, like they want to be honest. They want to talk about, I don't have a lot of time here left. So I think sometimes we try to skirt around it, and it's just be direct. And I think also, those photographs of my mom, like I had to, I kind of had to threaten her and twist her arm and say, look, you're not going to be here forever. So I need you to step aside, and I need you to do this for me and your grandkids. And I need you to not worry that you don't look like you're 28 anymore. And I need you, I need this. And so it's kind of a begging and a little bit of a threat sometimes. But I think once you say that to them and they realize that this isn't a photo shoot to put them in a fashion magazine, like this is for us. This is for us, and we need this.
So would you say Oh, go ahead, Annabelle.
Oh, sorry. I wanted just to riff off on that. What would you say has been your greatest challenge, as an artist, writer, philosopher within this project?
Wearing all the hats. The long-term goal is to have a full team. I do like every piece of it, but I know that this project can only get its wings when I find other people who are interested in, and when I can have a second shooter, when I can, that's been so tricky, because sometimes honestly, I forget to pull out my camera at the end of it because I'm so enwrapped in the story, and I'm just letting that sink in. And then all of a sudden I think, oh my goodness, I haven't made one photograph, and I need something, so then I'm kind of rushed and panicked at the end of the whole thing. And, so I think you know, the women are collaborative in and of themselves, and they're all about a network. And I think it's only fitting that this project grow into something that has a collaborative feel. So it's just been hard to wear all the hats and do it all as well as I would want to do it.
And if folks, want to support or find out more about this, definitely go to wisdomanthologies.org. Thank you, Philip Cuenco, who's been helping us out in the chat. And then, Antonio, did you have, I have a few questions, but I know you've been collecting them. Can you share any other? There's so many great questions.
Yeah, I will, and I'll add that we've had more questions continue to add as we've been answering questions. So thank you, everyone, including some people sharing some really, really nice, nice messages of their own personal experiences. We appreciate it. I don't feel comfortable reading some of these out aloud to everyone since they are personal, but I must say I love this question. We listen to the elder women. Who do the elder women listen to?
You know, that is a really, I love that question. I will say one, themselves. You know, they're finally at this place in their lives where they're not worried about what other people think. They're not worried about what the experts say. They're not worried about what they should do and they're supposed to do. But they listen to themselves. And I think that's really powerful. I think that's what we're all trying to do, is just, get to that place. I also, I think they can't, it's in their DNA. They're also listening to their ancestors, just like we can't ignore our ancestors as hard as we may try. So I think it's first and foremost, they're listening to themselves, but that's highly influenced by, their DNA and the stories that are in their blood.
Yeah.
Completely. And I saw a few comments, but one thing that, if you can repeat the name of the poet that you...
Oh, yes, John O'Donohue.
That was the opening poem. And another is, can you be specific of how this idea came to you? What was that conversation in terms of starting Wisdom Anthologies and starting this connecting the dots? Did it start with your mom and your family, or did you work from outside in? What was
Yeah, so I wanted to, like I said, I've always been drawn to elder women. I've kind of always been doing this unofficially. And I just more and more was getting frustrated with how, aging and all of this was seen as so bad, and like these women were disappearing and no one was taking them seriously anymore. And like, I think part of it was a personal like crisis of like, is this what's going to happen to me? And I don't want this to happen to any of us. And so I started to feel an urgency of like, this is, these women have something to say, and just because, they're not living these extraordinary lives of, traveling the world and, and all these other different kinds of ways, or, living in these big shiny houses. And so I felt like just highlighting their ordinary lives and the wisdom that they had is what we all could really use right now. And then honestly, I mentioned to someone that I know, that I was doing this, and he said, I know some, and it's the translator that I have, and he said, I know some women in Guatemala that you need to meet. And so that's where it started. And I just thought, oh my goodness, we're doing this. Like, I would just, it's amazing. You just say you have an idea and immediately people start feeding you that. And so.
Amazing. And can you, what was the native language that they were speaking?
Kekchi. So there's a few that sound similar. There's Kichwe.
Yeah, there's a few.
This is Kekchi. I can put it in the chat.
No, I think that's important to know that also your choice of going to the rural area of Guatemala versus the city or anywhere else has to do with your connection with nature, right? And the earth.
Yeah, and I think, even my own ancestors, lots of farmers, lots of people, I come from the clans in the Scottish Highland, so it's just like, I feel like it's in my blood to just be out in the country with the land. So yeah.
And what do you have coming up? Anything? I know you have your podcast, Iona, but do you have anything coming up in the virtual world that we should keep our eyes out for?
So yeah, I mean, really, so about once a month we release a new podcast on iona.co, and it's all about these kind of feminine ways of knowing and seeing and embracing the feminine, regardless of gender. So we release those about once a month, and that's on iona.co. And in the meantime, I'm currently working on a book proposal for Wisdom Anthologies, just taking the next step, and hopefully building a team over the next few years to keep this going. For me, it's part of a lifelong, endeavor. So
amazing. And hopefully we'll be talking soon about having possible prints available at Leica Gallery Boston. Such an amazing story. I feel like I could keep just listening, and I encourage everybody to visit AnneMarieVivienne.com and also wisdomanthologies.org. The podcasts are really good. I highly recommend you check them out as well. And follow us at Leica Camera USA and Leica Academy USA. Any more questions that we have, Antonio, to close before wrapping up?
I've got one final question I want to ask you, Anne Marie, and this has been a theme in a few questions that I've seen come from our fantastic audience. So again, thanks everyone. This is a time of distancing, and bringing our elders closer is always important in their later years, when they're especially ready to transition. Again, because I seeking your advice, what would you say to people that they can do to help make their elders feel close even when, and appreciate it even when you can't physically be close? Yeah,
oh man, my grandmother loved the telephone. I mean, I feel like we're so used to texting now, and it's hard to get on the phone and talk. I feel like I've become really bad at talking on the phone now. But I think even just picking up the phone, and I think, it is hard to talk on the phone, but, doing that, and also they want to hear about you. So, don't feel like you have to interrogate them, and use them as someone who sees you and loves you unconditionally. I mean, what a gift, like we're in such a world where we're constantly being criticized, and we're criticizing ourselves, I think, for our own sake, not just to make them feel like they aren't, it's not just patronizing them that they're needed, like they're really needed in a really heartful way. And I think use them, they want to be used.
And I hope will be an inspiration for folks to reach out to the elders around you. Could be family, could be your neighbor. And within social distancing, there's so many ways that we can be creative, and still let them know that they're visible.
Yeah. Thank you, Annabelle.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, Anne Marie. And thanks everyone at Leica Camera USA.
Take care, Anne Marie. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Stay safe, everyone.